Good morning, good afternoon, and perhaps good evening, depending on where you're tuning in from. I'm Mary Miller, Director of the Getty Research Institute, or the GRI, in Getty Speak. We live via Zoom more in the world than ever, even as the pandemic does begin to wane. And we seek to live in this world to bring understanding of the past into our present and future. Today here in Los Angeles, it's just a few minutes now, I think past 11 in the morning, where I stand on traditional Tongva and Gabrieleño lands. You, our audience, are in many countries and time zones, from South Africa to Australia, from Italy to Toronto, from London to New York. I welcome you all. We are hoping that we are taping this program as well, and we will post it on the GRI YouTube channel within a week or so. And we're hoping that you'll take another look at it if you've joined us today, or share it with your friends. I'm delighted to introduce the conversation today with Mark Godfrey and Allie Biswas. They are the editors of the recently published volume, The Soul of a Nation Reader, Writings by and About Black American Artists, 1960 to 1980. Many of you joining us today will be familiar with the title of this volume, having perhaps visited one of the venues that hosted the landmark exhibition, Soul of a Nation, Art in the Age of Black Power, co-curated by Zoe Whitley and Mark Godfrey, and organized by the Tate Modern in 2017, and that traveled for over 3 years. That exhibition resonates with me as the travel of the show to Los Angeles and the opening at our fellow Los Angeles institution, the Broad, in March of 2019, coincided pretty much with my arrival at the Getty and with the Getty Research Institute's launch of its African American Art History Initiative, or AHI, as we call it. I had missed the show in Brooklyn and just before I left the East Coast, and the installation at the Broad blew me away. For the GRI, the Soul of a Nation exhibition, a show that reviews have described as riveting and shining a bright light on the vital contribution of Black artists to a dramatic period in American art and history, offered the chance to connect with the artists featured in the exhibition and to explore how we would implement the main goal of the initiative. That is, through the archive-based research on the work of post-war Black artists, and that we can build a more accurate and robust history of American art that will have a decisive impact on the narrative of global culture. We were especially fortunate that a number of painters and photographers featured in Soul of a Nation accepted our invitation to visit the GRI at the time of the Broad opening and to participate in a series of group interviews, setting in motion our project to record oral histories with Black artists who indelibly shaped contemporary American visual culture. And so that brings me to the full significance of today's events, which will present and give context to a publication that explores the rich textual record that complements the visual repertoire brought to life by the Soul of a Nation exhibition. I'll leave the details of, I think it's already going to appear in the chat, of how to turn on closed captions or how to ask a question. I'll leave that for the Q&A. So just watch the chat to stay on top of that. And now it's my pleasure to introduce LeRonn Brooks, Associate Curator for Modern and Contemporary Collections. Thank you, LeRonn, for coming on screen. Dr. Brooks is a specialist in African American art, poetics, performance, and Africana studies. Prior to working at the Getty, he was on the faculty of Lehman College and a curator for the Racial Imaginary Institute. An alumnus of Lehman College and LeRonn Brooks received his PhD from the Graduate Center of New York City University. At the Getty, Dr. Brooks is the lead curator for the GRI's African American Art History Initiative, the aforementioned AHI, and is charged with building collections and organizing programming related to African American art. Known for his poetry, interviews, and essays, LeRonn Brooks can be read in Bomb magazine, Callaloo Journal, and the International Review of African American Art, among many others. I now turn this over to you, LeRonn, to continue with our introductions. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Mary, for your introduction, and thank you everyone for joining us today for this wonderful, wonderful discussion. Starting out, I just want to give everyone a sort of a brief introduction to the book itself, The Soul of a Nation Reader, by starting with a short quote by, excuse me, writer Andrea Kirsch, who says, "The Soul of a Nation Reader rounds up long, inaccessible material on Black American art and artists from 1960 to 1980 that was not online and only available through original catalogs and small periodicals, or even from radio programs of the era. Mark, Godfrey, and Allie Biswas have done a valuable service to the field of art history." And by way of introduction, a few short bios of Allie and Mark. Allie Biswas has degrees in English literature from King's College London and history of art from Birkbeck College at the University of London. She has held positions at the Museum of Modern Art and the Royal Institute of British Architects. And as a researcher and writer, she has published catalog essays on artists, including Serge Allen Netiga, Raina Banerjee, and most recently, Aki Manaro Niles. Her published artist interviews include those of Wolfgang Tillmans, Julie Moretu, Adam Pendleton, and Rashid Johnson. Her recent projects include a catalog about the U.S. Embassy's art collection in London, Mission by Art in Embassies. Mark Gottfried is an independent curator and art historian based in London. From 2007 to 2021, he was senior curator at the Tate Modern, where his projects included retrospectives of Rondy Horn, Gerhard Richter, Franz West, among others. His books include Abstraction and the Holocaust, published by Yale in 2007. His essays have appeared in Art Forum, October, and other publications. And in 2017, with Zoe Whitley, he curated Soul of a Nation, Art in the Age of Black Power at the Tate Modern. The exhibition subsequently toured to Crystal Bridges, the Brooklyn Museum, the Broad, the Young Museum in San Francisco, and the Museum of Fine Arts, Houston. His presentation at the Broad, was awarded the Association of Art Museum Curators Award for Excellence. Thank you both for being here for this discussion. I'm looking forward to it.
Thank you.
Thank you, LeRonn.
So I'm just going to begin with a few questions. And this one, my first question is for Mark. Can you say something about how the idea for this reader came about?
Sure. Well, first of all, I just want to say a couple of thank yous to you, LeRonn, to everyone at the Getty, and to Mary, but also just very quickly to Gregory Miller, the publisher of the book, and Miko McGinty, the designer, and Jennifer Bernstein. It's been a great, and Alexander Johns. We've worked together as a great team. And of course, Allie has been an amazing colleague. The idea for the book came about a few years ago when Pamela Joyner, who is a very important collector and trustee involved with the Getty Research Institute, invited me to write an essay for a book based on her and her husband's collection that looks primarily at abstract art. And my essay looked at the debates among abstract artists at the end of the 60s and the beginning of the 70s. Right now you see a Sam Gilliam on the cover of Art in America, and he was one of the artists in her collection. And while writing this essay, which concentrated on artists like Frank Bowling, Jack Whitten, Sam Gilliam, and others, I read as much material as I could find and discovered that a lot of the most interesting writings were done by the artists. But I was very aware also that it was quite difficult to find the material and that it hadn't been republished since the 60s. By the way, things are a little different now because since that moment, this was about 2015, since that time, some of the texts that are published in the Soul of the Nation Reader have come out also in the retrospective catalogues of some of these artists. Okwi and Wezor did an amazing show of Frank Bowling at the Haus der Kunst, where he published some of Frank Bowling's writings. But anyway, back in 2015, these writings weren't republished anywhere. And I thought that there could be an anthology that collected them because they should be more widely accessible. I was also aware that there are lots of anthologies of critical texts and texts by and about artists from this period of the 60s and 70s, anthologies around minimalism, around conceptual art, around institutional critique and feminist art and so on, but nothing that looked at the text that I was using to write this essay. And so that's really where the idea for the anthology began.
Thank you. And as a way of following up on your question before I ask Allie a question, how does it relate to the conception and development of the Soul of a Nation exhibition?
So actually the idea for the anthology came before the Soul of a Nation exhibition was conceived. I was invited to apply for an art writing award sponsored at that time by Absolute Vodka. And the way the award worked is that you had to propose an idea for a book in order to be one of the applicants for the award. And I proposed this anthology. And then I won the award. And then I suddenly realized that the debates that the anthology covered, especially debates around figuration and abstraction, could be the source of an exhibition. The exhibition then grew and looked at photography, it looked at art being made in the West Coast, especially around the Brockman Gallery in Los Angeles. But the idea for Soul of a Nation came about out of the anthology, and I began to work with Zoe Whitley, and we developed the idea together. And then for many years, the concentration was on the exhibition. Allie was working with me at that point to research further the anthology. But once the exhibition had happened, it felt that the anthology had to then, even though it predated the exhibition, that the anthology had to cover as much material as the exhibition covered. So there are a number of artists who are in the exhibition, and we felt that they should be reflected or be represented in the anthology. Early texts about Martin Puryear, for instance, or texts by and about Faith Ringgold.
Thank you, Mark. Allie, how did you go about finding the text? What archives did you use?
So I think when Mark and I first started talking, he was quite keen for me to be on the ground in New York because so much of the material was going to be in the US. So I was working in New York, and there were two main sites. The first was the New York Public Library, and the second was the Schomburg Center, which is a division of the library. And the Schomburg was really a key source for us. For people who don't know the center, it's based up in Harlem, and it's an incredible resource relating to African-American history. And that's really where I spent a lot of the time looking for these writings. And then outside of the Schomburg, I was looking at museum libraries and archives, particularly those museums that feature in the book. So exhibitions at, for instance, the Museum of Modern Art and the Whitney, the Studio Museum in Harlem, or the the Brooklyn Museum. And then also university libraries were very helpful, including places like Yale and RISD, the Rose Library at Emory, who has been collecting materials related to Black art history. So it was really a mix of sources.
Thank you, Allie. And I'll leave this question for both of you, Mark and Allie. What challenges did Black artists, do you feel Black artists faced in getting published during the 1960s and 1970s? This is for either one.
Well, maybe I'll kick off by saying, if you look at Art Forum this month, there's a fantastic roundtable about the Studio Museum, and most of, in any given current issue of Art in America or Frieze or Art Forum, there's a diversity of voices. Back in the 1960s, when that journal was beginning, that just wasn't the case. The editors of the magazine weren't going to see exhibitions by Black artists, and they weren't reading texts by Black artists, and they weren't looking at the writings of Black critics. And so they weren't publishing. And it was very infrequent that you would hear that I think Black artists felt they had the opportunity to get into the pages of what was called at the time the mainstream art press. Frank Bowling was one of the first people who, with Art News, was able to get a lot of his texts published, but that was rare. Most of the other artists had lots of challenges in finding a venue for their texts, and in some cases decided to start their own publications. And that's one of the interesting things that the book, between the lines in the book, as you see some breakthroughs into the pages of Art in America or Art Forum, but you also see really interesting independent projects like Tom Lloyd's Black Art Notes, which gathers a group of artists' writings together, or like Barry Gaither's short-lived journal, the Journal of Affairs of Black Artists. So I think there were a lot of challenges just due to systemic racism and the biases of the editors at the main art magazines of the time. But then that actually kind of kick-started a lot of independent publishing, which is interesting.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you. Allie, the anthology includes many group statements by collectives such as Spiral, Afro Cobra, Kamongi, and the Kamongi Photographers Collective. Can you say something about collectives in this period and what these statements were about?
Yeah, I think that the formation of these collectives were really about Black artists taking control of how they were represented. And it was really about Black artists believing that they had the power and the skill to do so, that they could celebrate Black excellence despite being ignored by institutions and publications. And when they did publish texts of their own, it was a time when art critics and publications, really weren't paying that much attention to their work. So I think that was the overall incentive for these groups, relating to self-determination, essentially. But I do think that the objectives of each group were quite specific and nuanced, and they were trying to achieve various things. So, you mentioned the Kamongi photographers. They were a group that ran as a workshop, and it was very much a forum for discussion and for critique of artists. It was a working space and very much a support network in that way. Whereas at the same time, the Spiral group formed in the early 60s and 63. And their reason for coming together, it was just before Martin Luther King's March on Washington, and they had a specific goal of exploring, what their role as artists were or could be during this time of racial upheaval. And I think they were explicitly thinking about the politics of the time. So that was like a very different mindset to Kamongi. And then with someone like Afro Cobra, a group from Chicago, again, they had quite a different approach. They had a formal manifesto that was published in Black World Journal. They were very interested in African heritage and what they described as the African family tree, and that was their source, that was their influence, cultural heritage, and striving to make images that were inspired by African people. So I think there's a real variety in terms of what these groups are doing.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's a really good observation, just in terms of especially the sort of Pan-Africanist connection in terms of finding one's roots and finding one's influence in traditional culture that happens to be based in African experiences that can be reinterpreted by African Americans as for their political interests and their personal experiences. Thank you, Allie. As well as the collective statements, there are also many times where an artist writer takes issue with other artist writers, especially concerning the question of Black art. Can you describe some of these moments of antagonism?
Sure. I mean, I think what's very important, you know, as we all know, there were so many different interesting artists working, but there was also a lot of pressure at that point in time for artists to define themselves and that where they stood in relation to the wider politics of the civil rights movement and the Black Power movement. So what was happening, you know, on the streets put a lot of pressure on people in their studios to define whether their practice was Black enough, whether their work was creating or embracing a Black aesthetic. And different artists took different positions on this and then argued with each other about it. One of the clear debates, I think, happened really between Frank Bowling, who saw himself as the voice of a group of artists in New York who were working more or less with abstraction. So he was very friendly and supportive of Jack Whitten, Melvin Edwards, William T. Williams, and Al Loving. But he looked and saw what was happening with the art of Benny Andrews, Faith Ringgold, Dana Chandler, and the Afro-Cobra group, Jeff Donaldson especially. And he saw that they were defining their political figuration as essentially the best example of what a Black aesthetic would be. And there was a lot of connection between their rhetoric and the rhetoric of Amiri Baraka and Larry Neal. And Bowling took it upon himself to say that their work was actually too illustrative, and that the real Black aesthetic was to be found in the work of abstract artists. And he made an argument that in the work of abstract artists, you often have plays on meaning. You have he used the term signifying, and this was kind of quite an advance of Skip Gates's use of it. And he was interested in the way, for instance, a Melvin Edwards sculpture might speak in the language to one kind of audience and with one set of meanings, and to another audience with another set of meanings. And he said that this kind of play with meaning was actually where a Black aesthetic could be found, rather than in the more direct, overtly politicized and uplifting work of, you know, groups like Afro-Cobra. And so these two camps really represented a strong debate. And in some instances, the people affiliated with the more figurative work looked upon the more abstract artists and called them Uncle Toms, or felt that they were selling out to the white art establishment, making work that was too easily being acquired by mainstream museums and that wasn't communicating. And these debates got quite bitter at times, and sometimes I think affected the artists who felt attacked. Al Loving made a very interesting change in his practice at one point, where, but I think that was very much after he was accused of making work that was too easily consumed by institutions like the Whitney. So at one point he stopped making the kind of geometric abstraction that he was making and started making a very different type of abstraction that involved cutting up paintings and putting them together again. His work became closer to quilts. So sometimes these discourses and these debates between artists, they actually had an effect on what other artists were doing in the studios.
Yeah, I mean, that's a really important point you make, the sort of rift between artists who were using more abstract ways to communicate, and artists who were grounded in more sort of the realism and the sort of political emphasis in that realism. You know, for me, it goes back to the New Negro, right? It goes back to Du Bois and James Porter, and, you know, what is abstraction and what is it, and is it politically useful? And so this is a really important conversation, because it goes back to the beginning of African-American art criticism, beginning with those writers and writers in kind writing in the 1920s and 30s. And it's interesting to know that, you know, through your reader, the artist writers are actually talking about they're actually in the tradition of this larger debate in terms of how artists, Black artists, can have an effect on the political, economic realities of our communities. And so, yeah, I think the reader does a really good job of putting the information before the public. Allie, this question for you. This publication has some text in common with the reader for We Wanted a Revolution, the show curated by Catlett and Ruhati. Can you talk about the emergence of Black feminist positions in the 1970s? 1970s, and about the text in the Soul of a Nation reader by and about Betty Saar, Kay Brown, Faith Ringgold, and others.
Yeah, I think the best place to start is probably with an article written by the artist Kay Brown that we include in the book, which was first published in the Feminist Art Journal in 1972. And by this point in the early 1970s, the feminist movement in the United States had started to gain some traction. So Ms. Magazine, which is probably one of the best known publications at that time, which was founded by Gloria Steinem and Dorothy Pitman Hughes, that first appeared in 1971. The Feminist Art Journal was established a year later. And in the first issue of that journal, Kay Brown, a New York-based artist, discusses the formation of the Where We At collective, which was a group of Black women artists that also included Faith Ringgold and Dinga McCannon, and Kay founded this group. And they came together to produce one of the first exhibitions of art that was made by professional Black women artists, which was held at the Acts of Art Gallery in New York in the summer of 1971. And just to mention that Kay Brown had originally been part of an all-male collective called Rayusi, based up in Harlem. But she'd actually left that group after they had failed to include her work in an exhibition that they displayed. And I think that establishing Where We At was not only a way of making women artists visible within the public realm, but also making a point that Black women artists were not synonymous with Black male artists. And membership of Where We At grew very significantly to include, dozens of women artists who had been excluded from opportunities to exhibit their work. And I think that Black women artists were being discriminated against on two fronts during this period. So they were having to find a space for themselves that didn't exist within the mainly white, middle-class, mainstream feminist movement, which didn't always align with their own objectives as Black women and as Black artists. But they also had to fight against sexism from their Black male colleagues, who often didn't see them as being equal to them. And a text that we've published in the book by Faith Ringgold, which appears a year later in the beginning of 1973, I think really speaks to this notion of revolution and radicalism as not being effective or even valid if feminism is not included, as part of those ideals. And And Faith Ringgold, along with her daughter Michelle Wallace and other activists, actually founded the National Black Feminist Organization in 1973, specifically to address, you know, the unique problems that Black women were facing at this time.
Yeah, thank you. And that in of itself is a kind of radical presence that, you know, Black women having to write themselves into history, or write a history in which the people who were the critics who were actually constructing these trees, these histories, did not actually see them. And so, you know, going back to what Mark was saying in terms of the difference in terms of approach between a abstract artists and artists who work in a more realist political line, there was a way in which Black women had to write themselves into history because they were being denied by male artists, but also the white critics who were then constructing a canon that didn't include Black or brown people by and large, right? And so, I mean, I think that work in of itself and the groups that you were, in the names that you were mentioning there is really important, because we should not forget the sort of the ways in which Black women felt it was their, well, they had to do the work, and they're still doing the work. And so, you know, yeah, that's a very important section in those readings. So Allie, this is a follow-up for you. Are there any texts in particular that you're proud to have unearthed and republished in your research?
There are a number of texts that we've included in the book that were originally delivered as talks or lectures by artists, rather than, say, a piece of writing that was published at the time in a journal. So there were a few audio recordings that we were able to find, and I actually transcribed some of these recordings, which we've published in the book. And one of these was a lecture given by Charles White at LACMA in 1969. The lecture was titled Art and Soul, and it formed part of a public talks program given at the museum, which had been organized by the Black Arts Council. And the Black Arts Council had recently been established by two Black members of staff at the museum, Claude Booker and Cecil Ferguson, who worked as art preparators. And the council was formed to ensure that African-American artists and audiences were visible and made to feel welcome at the museum. So our book is the first time that this lecture by Charles White has been published, which is amazing. And another example that I would mention, similar, is an interview with Linda Goode-Bryant and David Hammons that was part of a radio series that was broadcast on WNYC, New York Public Radio, which was organized by the Guggenheim Museum in 1975. And the conversation relates to the opening of the Just Above Midtown Gallery, which Linda Goode-Bryant founded in New York as a space for representing Black artists. And at the time, David Hammons had recently moved to New York from Los Angeles, and he would go on to show at Just Above Midtown just a few months later. And again, like, that was just a bit, you know, a revelation to hear this conversation that was really just kind of hidden away. And we printed that again for the first time.
Can I answer that question as well? It was interesting because I just want to mention again that on the I recently read in the Current Art Forum this great roundtable between Lowry Stokes-Sims, who we've got a text of hers in the book, Thelma Golder, Naomi Beckwith, and Thomas Lax. And at one point they talk about the first years of the Studio Museum and the question of whether catalogues were published or not. And when this project began, I obviously looked in the Studio Museum to look, you know, what I would like to try and find their archive of all their initial publications for the first 10 years of their program. And the museum didn't have that archive. And I think it didn't have that archive because, you know, back at that point, there wasn't the resources or the space perhaps to give to just having boxes of pamphlets that didn't sell, or maybe all the pamphlets sold out, who knows. But that meant that you couldn't just go to the Studio Museum to get hold of the text that the Studio Museum published back in the day. And quite late on in the course of putting this together, maybe a couple of months before we had to close our checklist, as it were, of texts, we found an Elizabeth Catlett publication from 1970 from her show at the Studio Museum. These publications are incredibly difficult to find because very few people have them, but it had a text by Jeff Donaldson. And so Jeff Donaldson was one of the AfriCobra group and perhaps their spokesperson, the person who'd written the key text, 10 in Search of a Nation. But just to see his way of introducing the work of Elizabeth Catlett was brilliant. So you had this one artist writing about another artist of a slightly older generation and putting her work in the context of a kind of global political moment that, you know, of the Black Panthers, of the liberation movements that were going on around the world, and thinking about Elizabeth Catlett through that lens. And so we were really pleased to get hold of this text late on and to be able to include it in the book. And there are a few others like that from the Studio Museum. For instance, they did a really important show in, I think, 1972, that was the first showing of Californian artists on the East Coast. Noah Purifoy wrote the introduction for this, and each artist in the show was invited to make a little statement. So there are statements by John Outerbridge, David Hammons, and so on. But this publication is like a little fold out piece of paper that you would have got if you visited the show. And somehow we found a copy of this, scanned it, and then were able to transcribe and publish these statements. Those are a couple of the favorite ones of mine.
Thank you. You know, it's interesting, like when you go back into the archives, you go back into the readings, you actually find things that people haven't seen for so many years, and it even invigorates, I can see, Mark, it invigorates you to actually be serious, to understand that how people were being written about and how people were kind of being honored, and going off what you said, being honored as well. So.
Yeah, you really get a sense of what one generation thought of another, and how, you know, an older generation inspired a new one. That's very interesting.
So for both of you, Allie and Mark, how do you hope the publication will help with future study of the period?
Allie, do you want to go first?
Yeah, I mean, I think the purpose of the book was so clear that you know, there wasn't a publication that essentially had all of this material to hand. There's no way that anyone would have been able to locate these writings otherwise. So from a very kind of straightforward point of view, it was a point about accessibility and visibility, and to I suppose introduce many artists, but also publications from the period that might otherwise not have been discovered. So, you know, the book is intended for teachers and students of this period as much as anything else. It's really meant as a textbook, as a source book for this part of art history that had, you know, may have been documented actually in many publications, but perhaps not in such a coherent way.
I mean, I think it would be very helpful, and there are lots of things that people could study from this. I mean, there's one clear thing is what was said about which artists and by whom, but another really interesting thing is how did people write, and what decisions did different writers make about language and style. And that it's very clear if you read some of the texts, and some of the texts are written in a very orthodox manner, using the kind of sentence structure, language, and so on that much of other criticism that was being published in places like Art Forum or Art in America in that time were written in. But then there are other artists and artist writers and critics, very much those associated with the Black Arts movement, who wanted to revolutionize language itself and to use idiom and phrases, line spacing, and wanted to, many people on this in the audience might have listened to the audio recordings of Amiri Baraka or heard him speak, heard the way he would speak out his poems, and how intonation was such an important part of the meanings and the effects of his writing. But you get that captured in some of the art texts. There's a brilliant text on an early show of Joe Overstreet, where the writer is really, it's not a formalist analysis of the work, but it's a piece of writing that accompanies the work, and it's in its own style, a style that's very close to Baraka's writing of that time. So that's another, another angle into the book is styles of art writing. I think that's relevant to today, because I think right now I see different young writers really trying to play with the form of art writing and challenge some of the orthodoxies of what art criticism should be.
Yeah, thank you, Mark. I think it also gets back into this idea of the artist writer, or the artist writer and the writer now who is entering an artist space, and I think that's an interesting sort of intersection. But my last question to you, Mark, here is what happens to writing by and about Black artists in the 1980s and 1990s?
So I think what happens really is a few things happen. I think that the politics of the Black Power movement kind of fizzle out a little bit, and the intensity of that time that changes a bit by the end of the 70s. And so some of the more politicized, like the direct politics, the activist politics, come out of art writing. But what happens also is that you get the beginnings of a different style of art education and more theorized MFAs. By the middle of the 70s, if you're a young artist and you go to study in one of the main art schools in the United States, for instance, CalArts, you'll have an exposure to continental theory and to lots of other kinds of discourses. And I think young Black artists who are beginning to make work at the beginning of the 80s are thinking about their practices through a different theoretical model than those who were making work 15 years before. And so you get a lot of different types of theoretical language that come into the way artists are writing about their work and critics are writing about their work. And you see that reflected in Charles Gaines's essay for a very important show that he wrote, that he helped curate, The Theatre of Refusal. You see that in the early texts about Lorna Simpson's work in the 1980s, or you see that in many of the texts that surround, Adrian Piper's work of that point as well. Different theoretical models. And I think it would be a really interesting thing, of course, to follow this up with another anthology that looked at the period of the 1980s and early 1990s, the next 15 years of art history, I think.
Thank you, Mark. Allie, can I ask you what's happening with Black women artists at around this time? In terms of their writing, or in terms of
sorry, LeRonn, I didn't hear that.
Can you describe what's happening with Black women artists around this time in the 80s and 90s in terms of their presence in writing or their presence as writers at this moment?
Yeah, I think that, there was, as the book outlines, this, a history of women artists either publishing their own writing about other artists. We also publish a lot of interviews with women talking about their work. I guess one of the later texts that we publish refers to a panel discussion that was held in 1978 And the article that we publish is by the curator Larry Stokes Sims, who at the time was a curator at the Metropolitan Museum in New York. And it's a reflection on a panel discussion that many Black women artists had at this time, reflecting on their status as artists by, you know, coming to 1980, like what was their status at that point? And I think most women at that time felt as though the feminist movement had essentially failed Black women, that they were still actually fighting a very big battle that was in no way over for them. And there was still a lot of tokenism, a lot of novelty in terms of how their work was being read and exhibited. Howardina Pindell talks about being a queen for a day, you know, the idea of it being a fashion to exhibit Black women artists in institutions. And so I think, like, as Mark was saying, the kind of the political dimension dies down, but they're still working and exhibiting and showing as collectives by themselves.
Thank you. Right now, I'm just wondering if it's okay that we just go to some of the questions we have in the time remaining. We have a lot of questions in the Q&A.
Yeah.
Okay, so I'm going to start with one here. Sarah Dickinson says, are there any texts that you chose not to include in the book, but that you thought were especially interesting?
I mean, I guess anything that we found very interesting that obeyed certain, I guess, there were certain types of text that we didn't publish and we found very interesting. For instance, monographic catalogue essays that looked at the career of an artist, but not within the context of a debate about Black art or the Black aesthetic. Those are texts we didn't include. So Mary Schmidt-Campbell, Dr. Mary Schmidt-Campbell, who was the director of the Studio Museum and made some amazing books. The first show there of Melvin Edwards, of Barclay Hendricks. She wrote really important early monographic essays on each of those artists and many others. But those texts are really just about those artists, and so we didn't include them. We did make reference to them, and I think we've footnoted them so that people using this as a resource know where to find them. There was, you know, a whole ton of small reviews, like one paragraph reviews, sometimes of a early Faith Ringgold show that we didn't include because we wanted more discursive, longer texts. So I guess those are the types of things that we found interesting but didn't include. But I should say that, yeah, I mean, we would love to know, you know, I don't know if this book could ever go into a second edition, and if any reviewers knew of texts that we'd missed out, it would be lovely to be able to incorporate them into a second edition. We know that there are things that we would have missed.
Thank you, Mark. Allie, is there anything that you found maybe in the Schomburg or somewhere that you were researching that a text that you thought it was really interesting, but you couldn't include in the reader?
Maybe nothing like specific, but I think, you know, we really did have like a long list that had to continuously be refined. And the only way that we could do that was to think about what the actual central argument was. So, you know, if these texts really weren't kind of talking about the Black aesthetic and weren't part of this wider argument, then that would be like the factor as to whether or not we could kind of keep it. But of course, that, you know, there were so many that we otherwise would have wanted to feature in the book.
I would also say that we had an incredibly generous and patient publisher who was willing, you know, when we said, look, when this book began, I thought there were 40 interesting or important texts. When it ended, there were 200. And the publisher was responsive to that. And so most of the texts we found really interesting are published in the anthology. Thanks to them.
Thank you, Greg, the publisher.
Thank you, Greg.
So how do you think, and this is for both of you, how do you think these earlier writings are affecting Black artists today?
You know, I think now that they're being republished, they may come into current discourse. I mean, there are a number of artists right now who are fascinated with this period. I heard at one point that Theaster Gates on the retreat that he runs in Chicago, at one point did a sort of rereading or performance of a round table that we include. This was a round table that took place at the Metropolitan Museum in New York. And it's a brilliant, I mean, I would almost say that if anyone wants to read one text in this whole anthology, it would be that round table. It featured Jacob Lawrence and William T. Williams and Tom Lloyd and a few others. And it's a really interesting roundtable between generations, talking about what it meant to be a Black artist in 1968. And there are incredible disagreements that are really interesting. But that I think, that's a text that Theaster Gates has returned to because he's very interested in those debates. So I think a number of younger artists might be looking back and drawing examples, strategies, and so on from the period of this time. But then again, a number of others would be, crafting their own language and way of talking about their work and the work of others.
Thanks, Mark. This is our last question, and it's from an anonymous writer who asked the question, so how could we use this as a way to think about Blackness more globally and across different histories and cultures?
Allie, do you want to start with that one?
I mean, I think that one of the sort of key messages of the book is the sort of nuance to Black aesthetics, to Black culture, the kind of the geographical variation as well. One of the things that we haven't really spoken about today is the way that the book kind of traverses the United States, and there's so many cities involved in this development of art and art history. And so it's kind of looking at America, looking at cities and cultural production in America, and the diversity that is sort of inherent in that cultural production, which I think is very relevant to what's happening right now and how we can read art that's being made in the US.
Can I answer the question with another example? Because I think the question was asking about Blackness globally, and there's a really interesting text in the book, which is an interview that Betty Saar did in the mid-70s, where she is asked about a kind of change in her work from the more the assemblages which used racist objects in order to craft a Black power message, such as the liberation of Aunt Jemima, and the move from that moment into a moment where she's making work that mines different types of myths, rituals, and so on. And she talks about her travels to Haiti and across the Caribbean, and her exploration of different religions, Hinduism, and so on. And she talks about, that type of, she's now wanting to make connections between her practice and like what we might now call a kind of Black Atlantic tradition, but also other cultures of the global South. And that's a moment where she indicates how her art is coming out of thinking of a more global sense of Blackness than simply a like a West Coast sense of that, or a North American sense of it. So that's interesting. Unfortunately, there's nothing. One of the things that I think is very interesting is Melvin Edwards' connection, that we've got great text by him in the book. Slightly after this period, he began to travel into Brazil and to make connections with Black Brazilian artists. And I'm not sure whether that led to any text that he wrote, but those are the sorts of conversations that he began that I think are very interesting in relation to that question that the audience member asked.
Yeah, thank you. There are. It was an interesting moment, especially in the 70s. You had artists going back 60s, 70s, artists going especially to Western Africa and sort of immersing themselves in local cultures, and like Mel Edwards maybe studying there with some artists and just integrating themselves in this idea of the diaspora, or trying to reckon with what it means to be part of a diaspora. So yeah, I think it's very, very interesting.
I think well, just to say that, you know, the Festac exhibition in 1977 was the great moment of that, where so many of the artists who we included in the exhibition and in this anthology, who didn't know each other in the United States, found themselves on a plane together to go to Lagos for Festac, and that was the first time they met. But they also met cultural producers from across the world. And since we began this project, there have been several publications dedicated to Festac that have come out with other publishers, After All, for instance. So there's a wealth of material around this subject now that students and art historians can look at that they wasn't accessible a few years ago.
Yeah, thank you. This is a little bit more time, if you guys are up for it.
Yeah.
How do you think, this is another question from, how do you think teachers might best use this book in the classroom, particularly for maybe high school or early university students?
Well, I would say that the first thing would be to be really selective about what texts to think about for people of that age. But I think, and maybe just to pick one or two, as I said, that the conversation that happened at the Metropolitan Museum would seem to me a good place to begin. Or another, if I was a teacher and I wanted to pull maybe one or two texts, another one might be Jeff Donaldson's 10 in Search of a Nation. And I would advise, if a teacher were to get together 10 slides of works by Afri-Cobra artists and that text, the text goes so well with the works and brings out so much that you see in the paintings of Nelson Stevens, Wadsworth Jarrell, J. Jarrell's dresses and so on, that would be a very, in terms of a pedagogical environment, a very clear example to say, here's a text, here's 10 works of art, and this is how the text helps draw out the ideas from the works of art. And then, another question might be, well, why do you think this artist felt compelled to write a text rather than simply paint 3 Black women? There's an amazing work by Jeff Donaldson, which is called Wives of Shango, which is, so a question would be that you could ask your students is, what was important about writing the text rather than making art? And that would, lead a lot of students to have to ask that question. What's important about the written word that the visual object can't do?
Thank you. Yeah, it makes complete sense. So this is actually the last question before remarks. You mentioned the question. You mentioned many interesting directions for future research. Are there any in particular that you are particularly excited to see, or any artists or writers you would like to see highlighted in these future works?
you want to go first, Allie, and then we'll...
Yeah, I mean, I guess many of the artists who were particularly kind of emerging, like the younger generation of artists that we cover in the book, I'd be interested to sort of track their development as writers, but also to kind of unearth new writers of the period, which I don't know enough about to talk on. Maybe Mark is more aware of that. But I would like to see some sort of connection and some sort of trajectory as to what happened to the writers of this period.
Well, one thing I'm interested in is that we have about 4 or 5 texts in this book that, as Ali mentioned before, come out of the Just Above Midtown Gallery. And that was a gallery that Linda Goode-Bryant started in the 70s. And we have press releases that she wrote on for David Hammons' first exhibition at the gallery, and excerpts from her book Contextures. And one thing I'm excited about is the project that Thomas Lax is working on at MoMA, which will concentrate on the Just Above Midtown Gallery and hopefully shed some light on the next phase. That gallery operated into the 1980s and operated across the visual arts and the performing. There were dances, there were performances there, and it would be really interesting to read. I'm sure that when MoMA do a publication around that gallery, that more texts from a later moment of Just Above Midtown will be gathered and republished, and that I think is an interesting moment, because it's a history of artists and different projects, but also of institution building and a Black enterprise. That gallery started both to create a space for amazing artists, but also to foster Black collectors and to sort of sell the work of artists. So I think that project is going to be really interesting to watch how that develops and what publications come out around it.
Yeah, absolutely. I tend to think that, especially as Just Above Midtown or as an archive, African-American archives are as vulnerable as the people themselves, so that Just Above Midtown is really important, because the archive of it lends to these future writings, or lends to the education that there was some kind of Black insurgent artistic activity happening. And just because the gallery closed doesn't mean the memory is closed as well. And I'm looking forward to that exhibition as well. So I think we have time for some closing remarks. Mark and Allie, if you want to have any.
I mean, I would just say, we're very proud of the book, and it's been wonderful to work with Zoe on the show and with Ali on this book, and really, inspiring. Also, I just want to say, I'm involved with the Getty on the advisory board or committee of the African American Art History Initiative, and I think this book also goes hand in hand with a lot of the projects that the initiative is doing. I mean, I had the great privilege to look at the way the Getty has begun to collect and look after the archive of Betty Saar, all her amazing sketchbooks, aspects of her work which just aren't published. And I think it's really interesting to think about this compendium of texts somehow accompanying other projects like the Getty's nurturing of the archives of some of the artists that we actually cover in this book. So I think it's been a very important few years where art history is able to spend more time on these artists, and I know that will lead to a lot of future interesting retrospectives and different exhibitions. I mean, I'm totally fascinated by the Brockman Gallery in Los Angeles, and they've got a wonderful archive. We've been able to publish a couple of the press releases that they put out to accompany their early shows by Noah Purifoy, for instance. And it would be lovely to see future research into the program of that gallery, which was completely revolutionary.
Mm-hmm. And Allie, any closing remarks?
Yeah, I mean, thank you to everyone who's supported the book so far. It's, you know, honestly, it was 6 years in the making, and I think that we were just amazed that it sort of all happened and came together in the end. The idea was to create something that was comprehensive, but also very accessible, and I think that that's what we managed to do with the book. You know, it is very easy to read as a chronological text, but it's also very easy to kind of dip in and out of it, and you know, to learn about artists and writers and publications from the period in a really fun way, I think.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I want to say thank you to you both for doing this amazing, I mean, for just creating this book, because people don't really, a lot of people don't understand how hard it is to actually the kind of footwork that you did to find these particular texts, because the existence of these texts wasn't necessarily a given. Right. And so to pull all these texts in together really connects us to not only the period that the book covers, but the period before it, because there is a continuum of the debates and the artists advocating for themselves and what they're doing. And it's important to remember them that we can also have something to stand on for, here we go, to the future of research. I mean, to your point of what we're trying to do with the Art History Initiative here at the Getty Research Institute, Mark, you know, so you're right. It does connect with what we're trying to do here, because it's important to have these testaments to our existence even. So thank you both for your work. And I also want to say that the Research Institute is having an opening of Blondell Cummings on September 18th at Art in Practice. And so we'll post more about that later, but thank you everyone for coming, and hope to meet you soon.